Well, welcome to Bible class this week, and we are going to be looking into John chapter 7. Following along, every week we do another chapter, spend just 20 minutes or so doing so. And what we encourage you to do is to read ahead so that you've read the chapter before you listen to the teaching. And I think that will help in a lot of different ways. So last week, PJ brought to you John chapter 6, and we're continuing on. And I think what we've been seeing, and I'll actually say with all the time I've been reading the Bible, that reading John chapter 7 in preparation for this teaching today, actually something stuck out to me that even though I'm aware of it, it just was really emphasized in my mind. And that is that we see this rising contention with the religious leaders and how it stirs up the people, because obviously they trust their religious leaders. They're seeing Jesus, and he's unlike anyone else that they have ever heard. And you'll see they make that comment in this chapter when they hear him speak. And it's not the only time the comment is made, but they make this comment about who is him, who is this man? Like, he doesn't teach like anyone else teaches. He teaches with authority, although they didn't say that here. We'll get to that in just a minute. But we definitely see tension rising, and just there's so much contention. And as we get into John chapter 7, the setting of it is Jerusalem, and it is during a festival. So before we get to that, I just wanted to, highlight the fact that when you're reading John chapter 7, coming out of John chapter 6 and 5 before that, you see this thread of contention that is being caused. Jesus doesn't shy away from it at all. Like, he says things almost for the purpose, I think, of poking the bear or causing, the distress in people to have to figure out, like, what do I believe? I have this in front of me, but it's not what I've ever seen before. It's not what I've heard before. I don't know what to do with this. And then you have the religious leaders really coming down hard against Jesus. And really what that comes down to is fear and control, because he was upsetting the apple cart. He was doing everything that seemed to overturn the stability that they had. In fact, they were trying to hang on to their nation as they were oppressed and occupied by the Romans. So there's so much about that you could look at, today's world or modern times anywhere to see how there's always these powers that are in a struggle to maintain their stability and power and control in situations. So that's what you see a lot here. Jesus caused a huge stir everywhere he went. And really, just coming out of John 6, we saw that he stood up and he said, drink my blood and eat my flesh. And it caused such an offense that a lot of people just left him. They just walked away. And then you saw Jesus asking his disciples, are you going to leave me too? And their response was, we don't, know anyone else. You bring us the word of life. And so even though they were challenged by what he said, they already had this revelation of, you're the only one, you're the only one, and I won't walk away from you. The few that did stay with him. I think Jesus oftentimes would be challenging because he was causing people to have to stop and think, like, what do I really believe? And what am I going to choose? Am I going to choose my comfort? Am I going to choose the safety of what I've already known? Or am I going to follow that sense I have in my heart, even if they did have that sense in their heart, that there was something special going on in the ministry of Jesus? I would say Jesus was not at all using modern church growth strategies. In fact, the things he would say to people, like in John 6, would drive, people away from him. So that's not a modern church growth strategy. And I think it reminds me of something that Ian Carroll said to us here at our church, where he said, you're reduced to your maximum strength. And you could go back and look at the life of Gideon and see how he had this massive army that had come to him, and God, gave him these different things that just caused by the end of it that he had 300 men in his army against tens of thousands in the opposing army. And that was their maximum strength, and God gave them a victory with 300 men over usual odds. So that's how God is. Like, I feel like he wants us to choose. He wants people to be true believers, and that causes sometimes us to wrestle with, what do I really believe? And if I'm offended by something, how am I going to sort that out and discover what truth is? So in John chapter 7, referring back to John 6, that was during the time of the Passover feast. And there were festivals, celebrations, several of them throughout the year, that the Jewish people would all gather together as prescribed in Jerusalem, because that's where the temple was. And they would celebrate. Most of these observances were a full week in duration. In John chapter 7, it's actually the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. It could be the Feast of Booths. There are certain words that it's called. Usually it's going to fall sometime in September or October. It will always fall in September or October. And this is a celebration where they're coming together and they are celebrating the harvest, because of the harvest of the season previous, that they had sown seed, harvested, and it was always a celebration because of the goodness of God. And they also celebrated the deliverance from Egypt, which happened, during the Passover time, but they would celebrate the harvest and their deliverance or freedom from the Egyptians during the Feast of Tabernacles. Something that they did during the Feast of Tabernacles is they would build tents or booths. That's why they call it. They take like branches of trees and they would stay under them. So just interesting. Sounds like a lot of fun to me. But this is what was happening. So right at the beginning of John chapter 7, we see it's not just the religious leaders that were contentious with Jesus. Even his own family was contentious with him. And we see in John 7, 3 and 4, his brothers, his blood brothers, were contending with him. And it's like they didn't have faith or believe in him either. I can't even imagine what it's like to have the people I guess I could imagine it. We've all probably experienced that at one time or another, where it feels like the people that are closest to us, they don't support us or don't like what we're doing, and we feel their rejection. And that's really what's happening in this case. So in John 7, in verses 3 and 4, this is Jesus' brother saying to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, where your followers can see your miracles." And they're just saying, it's time for us to go to the festival, so you should go. You should go now. They said, "You can't become famous if you hide like this. If you can do such wonderful things, show yourself to the world." And Jesus' response to that was, "You can go. It's not my time to go." And so they went on ahead of him. And as far as they knew, I think he was saying, "I'm not going to this festival," which would be interesting because they were all called to go to Jerusalem during the festivals. Well, we know as we read on that he did go. And he immediately went into the temple and began to teach. So he didn't go with them. He didn't go when people were expecting and people were wondering, where is he? Then all of a sudden, he shows up and he's in the temple and he is teaching. The rest of the chapter is basically this scene, and while he's in the temple teaching, there's so much going on. Like, you can imagine, like, so many of the stories or accounts that we read in the Bible are happening during times of the gathering. Like, Jews from all over would gather in Jerusalem. So you can imagine how crowded it was, that it would probably be shoulder to shoulder people. Many of them would be gathered in the temple area. And so there's a lot of activity going on. There's just a crowd. And to me, it almost feels like chaotic, like when I think about it. And when you're reading John chapter 7, you see that Jesus is teaching, but people are having conversations. There's probably other people in other locations that are teaching. It wasn't like Jesus went in there and had a billboard that said, "Jesus is going to be teaching from such a time to such a time." He just went in there and began teaching, and people would have been gathered to him and listening. But you see that people are having these conversations all over the place. The religious people are talking to people. The people listening are listening and also having conversations amongst themselves. And Jesus, in that, is also responding to them as this is all going on. So to me, it just feels like a real chaotic scene. All right, so he goes and he's teaching. And in verse 15, the people are wondering, how does he know so much when he hasn't been trained? So they're looking at Jesus and they're thinking, he is not trained like most of the teachers that we listen to. So how does he know so much? And he answered their question, even though I don't know that they were directing it to him. They were talking amongst themselves. And so he said in John 7:16, "My message is not my own. It comes from God who sent me. Anyone who wants to do the will of God will know whether my teaching is from God or is merely my own. Those who speak for themselves want glory only for themselves, but a person who seeks to honor the one who sent him speaks truth, not lies. Moses gave you the law, but none of you obey it. In fact, you're trying to kill me." So he's answering their question, but he goes on further and he brings like a charge against them that they're not even following the law that Moses gave because they're trying to kill him. And it just lit them up. Like they got really angry about it. And they were accusing him then of being demon possessed. And all I can say about that is, wow. And we see that in a few different places where they accused Jesus of, in one account, they accused him of casting out demons by the power of the devil. And he goes on to tell them that, a house divided cannot stand. But we see that people give him this charge, accusation, that he's demon possessed. And all Jesus ever did was he went about doing good and healing all. Jesus was so wonderful. You have to wonder, how could these people be so stirred up against him? How could they be that way? It's easy for us to look on this side of things from our place of faith and look back and wonder, but the Bible gives us lots of clues as to why these things were happening. Okay. All right, in response to their accusation, he points out their hypocrisy. And he says, he talks to them about the fact that they were mad at him for healing on the Sabbath. So we could just jump back to John chapter 5 when he healed the man at the pool of Bethesda and all of the uproar that caused. So he says, you were mad for me for healing on the Sabbath. But he points out the fact that even on the Sabbath, they circumcised their sons if it was the 8th day because that was their tradition. And basically he's just saying, hey, this is hypocrisy. You're mad because I did a good work on the Sabbath, but you also won't break your tradition of circumcising your little baby boys on the 8th day after they have been born. And he says, don't look at appearances, but use righteous judgment. So he challenges them and points out their hypocrisy. All right. Lots of people are listening to Jesus and they are having all kinds of side conversations. And they're asking questions, and he will sometimes address their private conversations. In verse 25, they say, is this the man that they're trying to kill? In other words, they're talking about the religious leaders. Is this the guy? Because, hey, he's standing right here and teaching. Could this be the guy? Because why aren't they doing something about that right now? Verse 26, could our leaders possibly believe he's the Messiah? Because if they're not arresting him, maybe they do believe. In verse 27, but how could he be? For we know where he is from, and when the Messiah comes, he will simply appear. No one will know where he comes from. I'm not sure where that comes from, actually. Verse 26, and Jesus answers these private conversations off to the side. He says, yes, you do know me, and you know where I come from. But I'm not here on my own. The one who sent me is true, and you don't know him. But I know him because I come from him, and he sent me to you. Okay, so it seems like Jesus is willing to push every button that he can push in these people. Tension is rising. In fact, in verse 30 of chapter 7, we see the first time that they make an attempt to arrest him. And it's really interesting because it just didn't happen. It's stunning to me. They tried to arrest him, and it says that it wasn't his time, so they didn't arrest him, which tells me and tells us that Jesus was in full control. And so at the time when they did finally arrest him, it was because it was the time for them to, and he yielded himself to it. They had absolutely no power over him. He was in full control. So here he is teaching in the temple. They're angry. They want to arrest him, but he doesn't allow it, so it doesn't happen. And so it goes on. The Pharisees heard the whisperings of the people, saying that he must be the Messiah because of the miraculous signs that he did. And they decide to send the temple guards to arrest him, so on a second time. I feel like I skipped over something. The reason that they didn't arrest him was, we have never heard anyone speak like this, and it's not his time. All right, in verse 37, this is my favorite passage out of John chapter 7. This is the last day, the climax of the festival. Jesus stood and shouted to the crowds, "Anyone who is thirsty may come to me. Anyone who believes in me may come and drink. For the scripture declares, rivers of living water will flow from his heart." When he said living water, he was speaking of the Spirit who would be given to everyone believing in him. But the Spirit had not yet been given because Jesus had not yet entered into his glory. So the rest of this chapter, and I'm going to probably go back to that if I have a minute, I may not. The rest of the chapter is just a continuation of all the disputation on who Jesus was. Some people believe, many don't. They argue amongst themselves. They make accusations. They wonder what the religious leaders are thinking about all this. And remember, the religious leaders are feeling like they're losing control, and they want to nip it in the bud right here and now. Like they are trying to get Jesus out of the picture. Also, I'd like to point out that many of the arguments that they had are based in misinformation. That's a word we hear a lot in our culture today, and it's actually maybe not misinformation as much as it was uninformed, like they were ignorant of some facts. They knew enough about what the scripture said, but they're not having perfect knowledge of Jesus and his history caused them to trip up on who he was or being able to receive it just based. God doesn't ask us to receive and believe in Jesus based on head knowledge. It's always a response of faith to what we're hearing. Like the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. They only knew that Jesus came from Galilee. So you hear them saying like, doesn't it say that the Messiah will come from Bethlehem, of the family of David? And we all know, we know that he absolutely was born in Bethlehem, but they just didn't know this, so that tripped them up. They were ignorant or uninformed of Jesus' history. And I look at that and say Jesus was hiding in plain sight. Like here he was right in front of them, and they didn't recognize him. And that reminds me of John 1:10, where it says, he came into the very world he created, but the world didn't recognize him. He came to his own people, and even they rejected him, which is really sad. But here he is. He's hiding in plain sight. Like he's there. The facts about his life are probably there for the asking. But they were totally tripped up. They were not able to recognize who he was. God does require us to respond with faith, heart faith, and not head knowledge. So our minds and our thinking and the information that we have locked inside our heads can oftentimes trip us up. I think about the two disciples that were walking to Emmaus after Jesus was raised from the dead, but the disciples weren't aware of this yet. And Jesus came alongside of them and was walking with them. And after he revealed himself to them, he disappeared. And the two of them were saying, "Didn't our hearts burn within us?" So here, they didn't recognize him because they looked at this man. They didn't recognize him. And I don't know how that's possible. I really don't. But that's what the Bible says. This is in Luke chapter 24, I believe. They didn't recognize him. But after he revealed himself to them when they sat down at a meal with him and he disappeared, they both were able to go back and think like, didn't our hearts burn within us when he was speaking the words to us that he spoke? And so I think that's a good indication of the fact, like, if we rely on our senses, our knowledge, the facts that we have inside of our memories and our heads, what we see, what we hear, and I'm talking about the physical senses. If we rely just on that and we don't learn to hear our hearts, because in this case, like their spirit man was relating to Jesus because their spirit man knew him. There was a heart connection that they had there. And so we need to be cautious of that as well, that we would be a people that would respond by our hearts. So the Pharisees were busy mocking those that believed, and yet they were the ones that didn't see. Over and over again, Jesus was speaking spirit and truth. He talks about that. And the natural man cannot understand it. In fact, John chapter 6, Jesus said these words to them when he's asking them, "Are you going to leave me too?" And they said, "No, you're the only one that has the words of life." And he was basically telling them that what he was saying about drinking his blood and eating his flesh, he said, "My words are spirit and they're life." Like, you have to listen and discern them in the spiritual sense. They are offended because they're thinking, are you telling me that's cannibalism? Like that's reproachable. That's wrong. You can't do that. And yet Jesus is saying, no, my words are spirit and life, and they're going to resonate with us in our spirit man. And that's where we have to connect with God in that way, because he is spirit. And we worship him in spirit and truth, and his words are spirit and life to us. So we want to be like those disciples on the road to Emmaus and recognize when our heart is burning, when we have that connection of spirit that's really bearing witness with our hearts, like this is the Lord. So in 1 Corinthians 2:13, it talks about this. Paul is saying, when we tell you these things, we do not use words that come from human wisdom. Instead, we speak words given to us by the Spirit, using the Spirit's words to explain spiritual truths. But people who aren't spiritual, they can't receive these truths from God's Spirit. It all sounds foolish to them, and they can't understand it. For only those who are spiritual can understand what the Spirit means. So that's really what I want to leave you with today. Really learn to hear with your spirit, with the ears and the eyes of your heart, that your discernment would come there. Going back to what Jesus said is like, have righteous judgment. Like, go deeper than the surface. Don't look at things and judge them just from the surface. Like, go deeper and operate out of righteous judgment, which means you're going to hear what the Spirit is saying about something. And that's how God's called us to live and walk out our lives. So thank you for joining me today in the study of the book of John. And next week, I encourage you to read John chapter 8. Yes, John chapter 8. And Jeff Hill will be bringing the word. So thank you for joining me. I'll see you next time.